Hey, good morning. Patricia Murphy here. It's Saturday. This is Seattle Now. Today we're bringing you the best from another KUOW show, Soundside, about how King County is preparing for a potential surge in immigration enforcement. Border czar Tom Homan said this week that Operation Metro Surge is drawing down and immigration enforcement officers are leaving the Twin Cities. The months-long campaign led to intense protest. 2 American citizens were shot and killed by immigration enforcement officers during the operation. Prosecutors in Minneapolis have been trying to investigate those shootings, but they say they've been rebuffed by the federal government. Like local officials everywhere, King County is navigating a shifting relationship with the federal government and the possibility that an immigration enforcement surge could happen here. Soundside's Libby Denkmann spoke to Leesa Manion and Gary Ernsdorff from the King County Prosecutor's Office.
Here to talk about how she's preparing for these possibilities is Leesa Manion, the King County Prosecuting Attorney. Hi, Prosecutor. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
And also here is Gary Ernsdorff, Supervising Attorney at the Special Operations Unit at the King County Prosecutor's Office. Gary, thank you very much for being here.
Thanks, Libby. It's nice to talk to you about this important topic.
Yeah, likewise. It's wonderful to have your perspective. So, Leesa, I wanted to start with you. Just on a 30,000-foot level, what have you been observing about Operation Metro Surge, how it's been conducted in Minneapolis, and how you have used that information to kind of prepare the King County Prosecutor's Office? How are you approaching this?
Well, first of all, I know Mary Moriarty, and I also know John Choi, who's in the sister city, St. Paul. So they have been a tremendous resource in terms of hearing from them directly, the challenges that they have faced, what they're seeing on the streets. And it has been helpful to share information. Not just John and Mary, but there are groups of prosecutors across the United States who are sharing information on fighting against federal overreach.
And how do you feel about those kind of interstate and intercounty cooperations? I know that there was a big push out of Philadelphia, I believe, the progressive prosecutor there, to kind of start sharing resources, working together. How do you feel about those efforts and how they're going forward?
Well, I think it's important because when we're looking at federal litigation, there are some rules that are universal across the entire country. I also think that those partnerships and learning from someone else's experience, sharing briefings, sharing legal research, sharing tactics is super helpful. And it's not just one group of prosecutors doing this. I mean, Fair and Just Prosecution is doing this. FAFO is doing this. The American Prosecutors Association, Major County Prosecutors Council is doing this work because we all want to see our community safe.
Gary, I want to turn to you on kind of the step-by-step for how investigations into use of force are usually supposed to go forward. The Trump administration initially blocked all investigations into the shooting of Alex Preddy and Renee Good. State and local investigators were actually physically barred from the scene, at least in the Preddy killing. After some backlash, the Department of Justice opened a civil rights investigation into Alex Preddy's shooting. But state investigators said on Monday that the FBI has officially notified them that they are not going to be sharing evidence, in this investigation for the state and local investigations. I want to get to that in just a minute and what you do when there's obstacles like that in your way. But just in a normal setting, under normal circumstances, how is the use of force by a law enforcement officer supposed to be investigated by your office? And we'll start with local and then we'll turn to the federal agents.
No, it's a great question. And we've seen a pretty dramatic shift over the last decade about how law enforcement investigates their own use of force. And it really started out with the Citizens Initiative I-940 that was passed in 2018 that changed the legal standards of when law enforcement can use force. But it also mandated independent investigation teams to go in and conduct a thorough interview. And the process is really laid out rather thoroughly in our state laws based on I-940. And it's based on 4 founding components, if you will. Independence is huge. You can't have the agency involved investigating itself. And so there's a lot of rules about who can and can't investigate. And it's designed to get a true independent. And then there's a credibility component where the folks that are investigating have to be skilled investigators with all kinds of training requirements and the experience necessary to conduct what is essentially a homicide investigation. That's what the statutes require, is that these are investigated with the best homicide investigation practices utilized. The third component is transparency, where there are regulations set up about how transparent these needs to be. There has to be contact with the victim's family, for instance. There has to be regular briefings. And it's designed so the citizens can see what goes on in one of these investigations. And the last component is communication, right? Communication is essential in these investigations. So again, the citizens can see what's going on in an investigation with routine updates, because all of that brings credibility, thoroughness, and accountability when police engage in conduct that can injure or kill a citizen. So the current investigation is really very thorough and robust, and it has been utilized for a fair number of years now, and I think the teams that are doing it in King County do a really good job. So
if this is, for example, a Seattle police officer or a Kent police officer or a King County sheriff's deputy or something that is involved in a use of force incident, you need an independent investigator. So you would bring in another agency to do evidence collection, things like that. How does that go forward?
Yeah, there's a perfect example. There was an unfortunate police shooting on Friday where SPD, Seattle Police, was involved in an altercation, and a suspect was shot, as was a police officer. And the protocol was instantly put into place where they call an independent investigation team that includes the King County Sheriff's Office and East Side agencies that are completely independent. It is so thorough that the individual officers involved have to complete a disclosure form so there's no potential conflicts. They can't have gone to the academy with one of the involved officers, for instance. So it's very thorough vetting to make sure that the officers that are investigating have nothing to do with the officers that are involved or the agency that was responsible for the use of force.
In the incidents in Minnesota that we've seen and read reports about, Alex Preddy and Renee Good, the initial response by local police and local investigators was to try to go and collect evidence, and they say they were barred from the scene. I mean, physically barred from the scene. There was, a local official who said in 20 years of this work, this was the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension Superintendent Drew Evans, in more than 20 years, he's never been denied access to a crime scene the way that, happened in Minnesota. So when we think about the possibility of an ICE surge or an immigration enforcement surge here in the Seattle area and King County, and then the idea that we would be trying to apply our local, Washington state rules for how to conduct these investigations to these federal agents, what are the things that you are contending with? What are you thinking about when it comes to how you would operate that kind of investigation?
Right. And that's really the $10,000 question. Maybe it's $100,000 with inflation.
Yeah.
But these are the questions. After Minneapolis, that was a big wake-up call for our jurisdiction and, frankly, jurisdictions across the country. We were almost immediately in contact with prosecutor offices all around, including Minneapolis, to try to get together a game plan. What are we going to do when an incident like this occurs in our jurisdiction? And, our goal is to ensure that justice is done, both for, the community, the victim, and, frankly, the officers that are involved. Everybody deserves a very thorough investigation, back to our basic roots of transparent, independent, credible, and with communication. And that's what these cases deserve. And what our fear was after watching Minneapolis unfold touches on what you just described. If we don't have access to a crime scene, if we don't have access to the evidence, if we don't have access to witnesses, how can we ensure justice is achieved for our community? And that's the question we're grappling with right now.
And Prosecutor Manion, just to be clear, do you believe that you have the jurisdiction to prosecute a federal immigration agent who comes to King County and uses force in a way that violates somebody's civil rights?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it has been the long-term policy of the King County Prosecuting Attorney's Office that we review investigations that are brought to us by law enforcement. And when there is sufficient evidence to file a charge, we do, especially when it involves an unlawful use of force or it involves harm against another individual. We take those cases very seriously.
What happens, we see obviously these shooting investigations are top of mind because somebody's been killed. They are deprived of their life. But what happens when we are talking about, say, an elderly gentleman? We saw the pictures of the Hmong grandfather who was marched out in his underwear in sub-freezing temperatures. And, people are entering, these ICE agents are entering homes with administrative warrants rather than judicial warrants. So maybe somebody's life is not taken, but the evidence shows that there were violations of civil rights happening. If that happens here in King County, is that something that, there could be local charges filed over, or is that have to remain like a federal issue?
Well, we would work with our, Attorney General's office. We would work with local law enforcement. We would, of course, trade notes with our U.S. Attorney's office to determine the appropriate course of action. It's very clear-cut when there is physical harm. It is murkier when there are civil rights violations or there is simply concerning behavior that may not rise to a state crime, but we can all believe and see that it's federal overreach, that is federal law enforcement agents who are taking things too far. So that is why we are hard at work building our network, sharing information, talking about the action that we'll take in various scenarios.
How does your office usually work with the U.S. Attorney's Office locally, the arm of the Justice Department here? And again, it really appears like that relationship in Minnesota is strained to the breaking point, not to mention the fact that the U.S. attorneys, the AUSAs seem totally overwhelmed there. And, we've seen high profile just sort of meltdowns in court. But when it comes to the way that the King County Prosecutor's Office and the U.S. Attorney's Office here typically works together, how is that supposed to work?
Traditionally, we have enjoyed a very good working relationship with our U.S. Attorney's Office. And, some of the things that we collaborate on are, addressing gun violence, addressing depictions of minors, child pornography cases. And we've always had great collaboration. I don't believe that our relationship has been tested in the way that it has been tested in other parts of the country.
Gary, when it does come to these situations where investigators have been physically blocked from the scene, again, not something that most local jurisdictions have ever experienced. This seems to be a new thing here with the way that these ICE operations, the immigration enforcement operations are being run. I mean, what are the kind of strategy conversations that you've been talking through with your team? And Prosecutor Manion, please jump in as well. What happens if it happens here?
Yeah, great question. And again, I think we started with the conversation with DAs all across the country to get different perspectives, not only in jurisdictions that have had incidents, but others that have been thinking about it similar to what we have done. So we started with the more of a global 30,000-foot approach to it. And now we have some good ideas about what needs to happen. Now we're partnering with the necessary folks in King County. And that includes, the King County Sheriff's Office, the Executive Office, our Civil Division, my unit, the Special Operations Unit with our Public Integrity team, and local law enforcement. So we really need to bring together a broad coalition of interested parties. Everybody's interest is to make sure that justice is served. Our goal is to have a playbook in hand, ready to go when an incident happens, so everybody knows who's going to do what. Whether it's filing an injunction in federal court to prevent evidence from leaving the jurisdiction, we need to have that ready to go out of the box when one of these incidents happen. The timeframes are really compressed for action. You can't show up at a crime scene a day later and expect to have a robust and thorough investigation. These things need to happen, in an ongoing, very quick manner in order to be effective. And so, yeah, we're getting our playbook together with all of our community partners.
There was a prosecuting office in Minnesota that had to file a restraining order in order to prevent evidence from being destroyed. I mean, did you think ever, Prosecutor Manion, that would be a reality in the ways that agencies, federal and local, are working together, that you'd have to file a restraining order to just get access to evidence?
I think we're living in unprecedented times. I don't think anyone anticipated what we're seeing in various jurisdictions across the country. I was asked this last week about immigration enforcement, and immigration enforcement has been going on in our community and in communities across the United States for decades, like definitely for the entire 30 years that I've been a prosecutor. And by and large, that work has been peaceful. And communities have not felt afraid. But what we're seeing now, the fear, the uncertainty, the masked agents, the unclear authority that allows agents to take people from their homes or take people away from public spaces, that is new. And that is what I think has the community on edge. That's why we are working so hard in King County with all of our regional partners to address this concern.
The issue of the administrative warrants versus the judicial warrants, that's a sticking point in Congress right now when it comes to DHS funding and this partial shutdown of the government. So there might be a policy change that happens as a result of these negotiations at the political level, the policymaking level. But just from a legal analysis level, judicial warrants are typically what you need to break down a door, right? I mean, can you just sort of explain the basics of this so that, folks are really clear? Because, when you hear from ICE saying we have a warrant, but it's administrative, it gets confusing for people.
Sure. When you have a judicial warrant, you have a judge that has listened to the reasons for the warrant and has made a decision to issue the warrant. Administrative warrants are often issued within the agency without a set of independent eyes reviewing the need for the warrant.
And, I would look at that and say the independence of the judiciary, it's kind of like a foundational piece of our Constitution in terms of protecting rights.
Absolutely. And it is also the way our system has operated, for the entire 30 years that I've been a prosecutor. And I know Gary sees this every day. That's exactly what his team does.
Mm-hmm.
And, going back to some of our core fundamental values, transparency, right? These administrative warrants don't have the transparency. They're often difficult to get a hold of, to get a copy. They're not filed in a regular database like our search warrants are. Washington courts abolished subpoena power decades ago because our Constitution, as does the federal Constitution, requires probable cause. Typically, subpoenas are at a lesser level, and I'm not sure about what authority they think a subpoena has to kick down a door in the state of Washington, but I'm very suspect of that legal basis.
I want to turn really quickly to some of the arguments that we've heard from the president and other folks in the administration. They say, if only local jurisdictions would cooperate with immigration enforcement, we wouldn't have to do these, mass scaling up of crackdowns of immigration raids, things like that. We could have a more orderly process of getting people from jails and prisons. Now, in Minnesota, state prisons did work and have worked with immigration authorities to hand over people when they are on an ICE hold. Do you have any reaction to kind of that idea that it's sanctuary jurisdictions like King County or like the state of Washington that are stirring up the need for ICE to create this more aggressive approach?
Sure. I would say for, the so-called sanctuary cities, we have long had in place ordinances and laws that reflect our values as a community, that have said, for example, in King County, that we will not cooperate with federal authorities in ICE removal or ICE detention. And that has operated peacefully under a number of administrations. Under the current administration, it really feels like what is driving the behavior is just an outright offense at our values in this community.
Prosecutor Manion, one more question when it comes to local policy. The King County Executive, Gurmai Zahalai, recently signed an executive order that bans immigration officers from non-public spaces and county-owned spaces.
Correct.
In the city of Seattle, I know that the mayor has also said that immigration officers cannot use city property to stage operations, things like that. What happens if they violate those executive orders? I mean, is that something that your office would then file charges over?
Well, we would look at that again. We would have to look to see, is it a physical harm that happened in that space? Is it a violation of civil rights that happened in that space? Is it a matter that we would have original jurisdiction over? So again, that is why it's so important that we are coordinating with all of our partners, with the Attorney General's office, with the exec's office, with local law enforcement. And then, of course, the relationship with the U.S. Attorney's Office here has not been tested. But, I mean, we can't rule them out as a partner.
Yeah.
Not at this stage.
I'm talking with King County Prosecutor Leesa Manion, as well as Gary Ernsdorff, who is the supervising attorney at the King County Special Operations Unit. Gary, we're going to wrap the portion of our conversation where we're talking specifically about ICE operations and the ways that your office, the King County Prosecutor's Office and Special Operations, is looking at potential charges if there are violations of the law by federal agents here in King County. What else do you think people should know about this and how your office is preparing?
Well, we're really dividing this into a couple of different theaters. And the first one is the investigation component, right? If we can't get a thorough and complete investigation, we're really dead in the water from a prosecutorial standpoint. So our focus right now is ensuring that we have access to the evidence that we need in order to assess whether criminal charges are appropriate or not. The second question about where charges should be filed, what kind of charges, what's the long-term litigation process, we have a lot of time to plan that. So our focus right now has been on that immediate concern about we need to be able to review the evidence in order to make informed decisions about whether or not to bring criminal charges. So that's our primary focus. The litigation questions are messy and complicated, but we have models across the country where federal agents have been prosecuted by state and local authorities. So we feel like that is a little bit more understood universe. So right now it's concentrating on making sure that we have access to the evidence we need.
What if the president decides to pardon members of ICE or other federal agencies for actions that they might take in the course of their duties, even if they're outside of the way that they're supposed to be acting or the law?
Yeah, that's a great question. The president can pardon for federal offenses. The presidential pardon does not extend to state charges, and so that's an interesting question. But we feel like if we bring a state prosecution, we're going to be protected from federal pardons. And
this might be beyond your purview of editorializing at this point, but is that another reason to conduct simultaneous state and local investigations in these kinds of cases, that you don't know what's going to happen with federal agencies anymore and we're in uncharted territory?
I think that's certainly a consideration, absolutely. And we also know from actions in other areas that this administration doesn't necessarily respect the rule of law, right? We have seen the flagrant disregard for the rule of law and for the limits on federal authority.
I want to ask you, Prosecutor Leesa Manion, here with me right now on KUOW. You have been a proponent of Senate Bill 5855, which is working its way through the session in Olympia right now. That's the bill that would ban face coverings for law enforcement officers in the state. It's passed the Senate. It's now in committee in the House. Democrats seem pretty much on board with getting this through this session, even in the short session. California, though, passed a similar law last year that was aimed at federal officers, and the Trump administration sued over it. A judge blocked the measure, saying that it was unconstitutionally discriminating against federal agents. Do you believe if Washington's law passes that it would stand up to legal scrutiny or a legal challenge?
I believe so, because it applies to all law enforcement in our state. And I just testified in favor of that bill this morning. I think it's an important bill because it promotes public safety and it promotes trust. When you do not know who is exerting authority over you, it causes fear and it's unnecessary. The other thing about being faced with an unidentifiable agent, it makes it very difficult to determine who is law enforcement and who is impersonating law enforcement. So I am in full support of this bill because I think it will make our community safer.
King County Prosecutor Leesa Manion, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And we also spoke with Gary Ernsdorff, supervising attorney at the Special Operations Unit at the King County Prosecutor's Office. Gary, thank you for your expertise.
Thank you, Libby, for having us today.
Appreciate you listening to Seattle Now, and thanks to our generous donors for your support. Help us out by rating and reviewing the show on your favorite podcast app. Soundside is produced by Sarah Leibovitz, Jason Burrows, Gabrielle Healey, Hans Anderson, Jed Kim, and Maleeha Syed. Greg Kramer does our theme music. Seattle Now and KUOW Public Radio are members of the NPR network. I'm Patricia Murphy. See you soon.